event. I am very excited to have my own Kirkland City Councilman here tonight. He's a former state legislator. He's the president of the Washington Coalition for Open Government, and he's going to be talking about transparency in government. And with no further ado, I want to introduce Toby Nixon. And actually, Toby, I have a couple of questions for you before you launch into your talk, if that's okay.
Sure, go for it.
So,
Actually, my stuff's situated.
So, you've run for state office a number of times.
I've run 10 times in my life and won 5 times.
And, you've won. So, with that, I'd like to know, what do you feel the value of running for a nonpartisan race is? What's your opinion of running for nonpartisan races?
Well, I think the key to winning an election is how many people you know and how many people know you. Mm-hmm. And if you even just run for a nonpartisan race, you get to meet a lot of people. You can also meet a lot of people by being in service clubs or being involved in the soccer league or all these other things. But by running for office, you get to meet a lot of people. If you win and serve as a city council member or a school board member or whatever, you meet 100 times as many people. And then they get to know you. They know what a good job you can do, that you can get things done. And then they tell all their friends. And so when you then want to run for a partisan office, you have a bunch of people who are ready to endorse you and contribute to your campaign. So then the label doesn't matter quite as much, maybe, because you have the relationship. You like to think that, but sometimes what happens based on political labels is completely out of your control.
Interesting.
Like, I would have hated to have been running in 2016 as a Republican on the same ballot with Donald Trump.
Yeah, particularly in our district.
Yeah, that's right.
So, okay, I had one more question, and then I'll let you go free here. Do you have one single piece of advice to every Libertarian in this room right now? And I just put you on the spot.
Well, yeah, that would have been a nice one to think about a little bit. But the key is to be able to have crisp, inoffensive answers to people's questions.
What was that? Inoffensive?
Inoffensive, right? And I love Mary Ruart. How many of you are familiar with her writings? You know, she does a great job of coming up with crisp ways to explain libertarian principles that don't scare people. And I think that's where we really need to be able to get to, is to help people not only understand what we stand for, but how we reasonably will get there.
How to get from A to B.
Because most of the time they just dismiss us as radicals who want to overthrow the government. But no, there's a path to get to where we want to be. It took us 240 years to get to as bad as it is today. Hopefully it won't take that long to get back to what the founders envisioned. But we can't expect overnight change. And we have to be willing to be patient. But that also means we need to be able to start educating people about where we want to go and how to accomplish it.
Okay, well, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Toby. I'm excited to hear what you have to say, and then we will maybe have a little Q&A.
Oh, absolutely.
Then. So, all right.
Yeah, you gave me till 8:30, and I don't think I'm going to talk that long. So
well, you can
that's
have
good.
As much time as you like.
So thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. I always enjoy coming to Libertarian events and being able to talk frankly to people who are of like mind. A little bit about me first. I've been a Libertarian, a member of the party since 1980, back when Ed Clark was running for president. And it was interesting how I got introduced to it. I actually was working on John Anderson's campaign in Florida. How many of you remember John Anderson? A couple, yes, us old guys.
Old part here.
Yeah. John was a Republican initially running against Reagan, and then switched to running as an independent. And I was working on his campaign because I didn't particularly like Ronald Reagan, and was making phone calls for him and reached a guy who I offered to send some Anderson literature to. He said he'd be happy to take my literature if I would take his. And he sent me information about Ed Clark and also a copy of Restoring the American Dream by Robert Ringer. Have any of you ever read that book? It's a great book. It's a great introductory book. And I've been a libertarian ever since, finally recognized what I really was. And I moved from Florida to Georgia in '84 and immediately became active in the Libertarian Party of Georgia, served as state party secretary, also served for a number of years on the board of Advocates for Self-Government. Are any of you familiar with Advocates? No. Well, I'm going to have to kick it up here a little bit, because Advocates is one of the best organizations for teaching how to talk about libertarianism. How many of you ever taken the world's smallest political quiz? Yeah, see, the Advocates for Self-Government published the world's smallest political quiz. And when I was on the board, it was the first time we did an online version of that, and that's when it really took off. Before that, it was all little, like 3x5 cards. Anyway, as Michelle mentioned, I served in the State House of Representatives from 2002 to 2007 as a Republican, and I've then served as a fire commissioner on a platform of abolishing the fire district, and I succeeded. Of course, I succeeded by having the fire district absorbed into the city of Kirkland. So that was and then shortly after that was elected to the Kirkland City Council, and I'm in my 7th year on the City Council. When I was in the legislature, I worked a lot on government accountability and transparency issues. Because of that work, was invited to join the board of the Washington Coalition for Open Government, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, statewide organization dedicated to protecting the people's right to know what their government is doing. And so I joined that board in 2005, and then completely unintentionally became president in 2007 and have been president ever since. So that's me. I want to talk a little bit about how we got into where we are with open government laws in Washington. How many of you remember kind of the big political controversy that was going on in the early 1970s? I know some of us were here in the 1970s. Watergate, yes. You know, there was a great turmoil throughout the country about political corruption and dirty tricks. And I mean, they even went so far as to name the president's re-election committee CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president. And people really wanted to drain the swamp then. It hasn't happened yet. But there was a great uproar around the country about transparency and needing to know what the people in government were doing. And that it was true in Washington State as well. In 1971, the legislature passed the Open Public Meetings Act. Now, of course, they exempted themselves from the Open Public Meetings Act, but they did make it possible for us to at least be able to observe all of the business meetings of every government agency governing board, which was a huge improvement over what it had been before, which was that a lot of those meetings happened in secret, not even announced to the public. And then in 1972, there was a big move during the legislative session to also pass a state Public Records Act, similar to the Federal Freedom of Information Act that had been passed just a couple of years before. But the legislature refused to take up the bill. And so a group of people, a coalition of organizations actually, that was very politically diverse, came together and formed a group called the Coalition for Open Government. And they ran an initiative. It became known as Initiative 276, the spirit of 76. Over the course of that spring and summer of 1972, they collected more than twice as many signatures as they needed to get it on the ballot. That was how strong the feelings were at the time. Now, back then, they had the advantage that they had long lines of people waiting in lines at movie theaters. That was the year that The Godfather came out, and there were huge lines everywhere. And I was talking to one of the guys who was the executive director of the group, and they said they got probably the majority of their signatures in movie lines. But that initiative made it on the ballot, clearly, And then in November of '72, it passed with 72% of the vote, which until then was the highest vote percentage ever received by an initiative in Washington State. So again, you see how important this was to the people. And it became known as the Public Disclosure Act. And many of you who have been around Washington for a while have heard of the Public Disclosure Act. What people had come to realize was that if we, the people, are sovereign, which we are, meaning we control the government, then we have to know what the government is doing, what the people who are in the government are doing, in order to be able to hold them accountable. And we must also know who is it that is trying to influence candidates and elected officials, such as through campaign contributions. There were 4 major parts of the Public Disclosure Act. The first was campaign finance disclosure. Any of you who are run for candidates are familiar with the Public Disclosure Commission having to submit detailed reports about who contributes to your campaign, what you spend your campaign money on, what loans you've taken, what pledges you've received, all of those things. That all came about because of I-276. The second major part of the law was personal finance disclosure, meaning anyone who runs for office or serves in public office, and including high-level non-elected offices, has to submit a report every year on who they work for, what businesses they own or on the board of directors of, how much money they have, and in broad categories, not exact numbers, what banks they do business with, what real estate they own, all kinds of financial disclosures, the point of which is so that the people will know what potential conflicts of interest they have. That's what that's all about. The third major part was lobbyist disclosure. People wanted to know how much money are lobbyists spending trying to influence our candidates and elected officials. And interestingly, the candidates and elected officials have to also report how much money they had spent on them, like lunches and dinners and stuff, by lobbyists. And so we can match up those and see who's left out something. And the fourth part, which was probably the least talked about during the campaign for I-276, but which has clearly become the most widespread and most used part of the law, was the public records portion. In 2005, I sponsored a bill to separate the public records portion out of RCW 4217, the Public Disclosure Act, and put it in its own chapter of law, which is now RCW 4256. And that was just because it had grown so much and become so unwieldy that it really needed to be a separate law. So, I'll talk a little bit about this public records portion of the law. At its core, it says that all records that are prepared, owned, used, or retained, and notice it's or, not and, prepared, owned, used, or retained by any public agency at the state or local level, is subject to inspection and copying by anyone who asks, unless it is exempted by a specific provision of law. And at the time the law was passed, there were 10 exemptions in I-276. Now there's about 500. People say, what's up with that? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the Federal Freedom of Information Act has only 10 exemptions, but they're very broad and open to interpretation, and there's a lot of disputes about what they mean. And it allows federal agencies to pretty much arbitrarily deny access to records because they think they can fit it into one of those 10 exemptions. In the Public Records Act, there's 500 because the law requires them to be very narrowly crafted and very narrowly interpreted. And so you see exemptions for a specific field in a database. It's really down to that level. And so there's fewer opportunities for disputes over the Washington public records exemptions than there is at the federal level. So in general, you should be able to get access to almost anything even if a piece of a record is exempt from disclosure, they have to redact that, black it out, and give you all the rest of it. There are timelines, strict timelines in the Washington law that aren't in the federal law. And when you make a request, they have to respond to you within 5 business days. How long it takes to get the actual records depends on a lot of other factors, like how deep they are in storage and how hard it is to search for them and how much of it needs to be reviewed and redacted and those kind of things. But still, the courts have said agencies have to respond promptly. And another key difference between Washington's law and a lot of other states is that they can't charge you for searching for records, for reviewing them, for redacting them. In some states, if you request some records, it could cost you tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to have the agency's attorney do all this review. Washington doesn't allow any of that. The only thing that an agency can charge you is the actual cost of making copies. And so that kind of makes our law separate and much better than those in a number of other states. A key principle, which I already mentioned, is that if you read the original initiative, the law was meant to apply to every agency in every branch of government, both state and local. So if you think about what are the branches of government, it's the executive for sure, but also the legislative and judicial. This was very clear during the campaign for I-276. The legislators at the time complained about the fact that they would have to disclose their records. So did the courts. The courts argued about whether the much higher copying costs that they had built into the law for themselves would be wiped out because this law only allowed them to charge the actual cost of copies, not the highly profitable rates that they were charging. And so it was well understood at the time that it was meant to apply to all of these agencies of government. Well, unfortunately, they made a minor drafting error. And even though they used very broad terms like agencies and those kind of things, they didn't explicitly use the word court as a type of agency. And so the courts, about a decade ago, through some cases where people had requested records from the courts and the courts had denied them, and then appealed the case to another court, so they're appealing it to themselves, decided to exempt themselves from the law. Just the Supreme Court said, this law doesn't apply to courts, sorry. Didn't have the actual word court in it. And so that was kind of a loss. We have since gotten the court rules amended so that administrative records of courts, for the most part, are available, but under different terms than what's under the Public Records Act. And it can be a lot more expensive, a lot more time-consuming to get court records than from other types of agencies. Over the years, the legislature really bristled about the fact that they were expected to turn over records. They kept denying them and daring people to sue them. And this even though legislators at the local level of government, like city council members, county commissioners, and council members, etc., just turned over their records, right? There was no argument. It clearly applied to local legislators, but the legislature disputed it, which was kind of strange because they never disputed that the campaign finance disclosure provisions applied to them. They never disputed that the personal finance provisions applied to them. And they never disputed that the lobbyist disclosure parts applied to them. It was only the public records part that they disputed. And finally, the media and other open government advocates, but mostly the media, decided that they had to take a stand on this, on the legislature's repeated refusals. And so in early 2017, the Associated Press, King TV, Cairo, and a number of newspapers from around the state did a public records request to each of the 147 legislators and asked them for things like their emails, their text messages, their appointment calendars. and also disciplinary records of the legislature. They asked for any complaints about sexual harassment because it was an interesting kind of hot topic, and still is. We just recently had yet another legislator accused of sexual harassment. Of the 147 legislators, 3 turned over their records. 3. And 2 of those didn't turn over all of what was asked for, just most of it. But all of the others, all the other 144 legislators claimed that they were exempt from the law. And so these media companies decided, well, this is the time we're going to sue. And so in September of 2017, they filed a lawsuit in Thurston County Superior Court saying that the legislature was in violation of the Public Records Act. And that worked its way through the briefing and hearing process until on January 19th of this year, which is actually pretty fast for a Superior Court case. You're talking about like 4 months. It was really lightning fast. But on January 19th, this is after the legislative session started this year, the judge in the Thurston County Superior Court found in favor of the plaintiffs, in favor of the news media, and said the legislature has misinterpreted the law, that there are specific types of bodies or offices within the legislature that are exempt because of other laws, but that the legislators and their offices were not exempt from the law. And the judge ordered them to release all those records. Of course, the legislature turned around and moved for a stay while they appeal, and the judge granted that. That's pretty typical. About a month later, on February 21st, without any warning at all, a bill was introduced in the legislature. It received the number Senate Bill 6617. I was alerted to this by Jason Mercier of Washington Policy Center, a close friend of mine, and because he watches every bill that gets introduced in the legislature to see what they're trying to do. We both looked at the bill together and realized that the legislature was trying to make an end run around the court decision by making themselves explicitly exempt from the Public Records Act retroactively. There were a lot of other problems with the bill, which I will talk about in a minute. I started to spread the word on social media that evening, and it took off like wildfire around the state. The newspapers picked it up that same day and started doing articles and blog posts and Twitter posts about it. But there wasn't much time to act. The next day, the bill was brought up on the floor of the Senate, which all bills have to be the day after they're first dropped in the hopper. And instead of assigning it to a committee, referring it to a committee, which is what normally happens with a newly introduced bill, they waived all that process and put it directly on the second reading calendar, meaning they were going to bring it directly to the floor of the Senate for a vote without any committee hearings. They did actually have what they called a work session, an opportunity for people to come and complain at noon on February 22nd. This was less than 24 hours, about 20 hours after the bill first appeared on the legislature's website. They were already having a hearing. Not a hearing, a discussion. It wasn't a formal hearing. And there was no formal testimony on the bill. Only 5 people were able to make it to Olympia on such short notice to speak against it. They did a great job in highlighting all the problems with it. But the fact is that this was just a formality. The legislators just wanted to be able to say that they had given an opportunity for the public to be heard. But it was nonsense. Without any consideration of anything that was said in that meeting, the bill was brought up on the floor of the Senate the next morning, February 23rd, and with no debate, no floor debate whatsoever, it was passed by a vote of 41-7. they immediately hand-walked it over to the House. And if any of you have ever been in the state capitol, you know you could just walk from the back door of the Senate chamber right across the rotunda over to the back door, or the back door of the House chamber. And that's exactly what they did. The House was already in session waiting for the bill to arrive. They brought the bill up on the floor of the House. They did have a floor speech. They had one from one Democrat and one from one Republican, and they both voted in favor of the bill. And then it passed the House by 83 to 14. So here we have a bill that was introduced, no normal process, no meaningful debate. It went from introduction to passed by both chambers in less than 48 hours. It's completely unheard of. And it turned out that there were a lot of reasons why they wanted to make this happen quickly, because they were hoping to just push it through the process before anybody could react. But it turns out that that weekend, the governor was not even in Washington State, so he couldn't sign the bill immediately, which had been their plan. The governor had gone to a conference in Washington, D.C. Some of you might remember that. That was the time that he stood up in a meeting with the president and made some snarky comments about he should do less tweeting, which probably wasn't a bad thing to have said to the president, but the fact is the governor wasn't there. But the governor was interviewed in Washington, D.C. by representatives of the Washington State news media and asked, do you intend to sign this bill? And he said, well, it's veto-proof, right? It passed by far more than the 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate that are necessary to override a veto. And so it seemed at that moment like it was a done deal. As soon as the governor got back, he was going to sign the bill. On February 27th, and this was a Tuesday, 13 of the 13 largest newspapers in the state of Washington did something that had never happened before. Every one of them published a front page editorial. I mean, how often do you see an editorial on the front page at all? But to have 13 daily newspapers publish a front page editorial calling on the governor to veto the bill and calling on the public to contact the governor and contact their legislators and say that this is a terrible bill was an amazing thing to see happen. And there were a number of other newspapers that published editorials on their normal editorial page. There were weekly newspapers that published it on their normal publication date later in the week. It was dozens of newspapers around the state that took a stand on this. And the response from the public was immediate and monumental. Over the following few days, well, actually 2 days, that's how quickly this happened. Over 20,000 calls and emails were received in the governor's office, and tens of thousands of more received by legislators. The legislators quickly realized that they had made a mistake. I don't think they yet realize how big of a mistake they made, really. But 3 of the 4 legislative caucuses, for whatever reason, not the Democratic caucus in the House, but both caucuses in the Senate and the Republican caucus in the House, sent a letter to the governor asking him to veto the bill. And he did. On March 1st, the governor vetoed the bill. But what we've seen happen since then has been very odd, actually, to observe. And most of you probably watch what your own legislators do, but maybe not other legislators around the state. I keep a pretty close tab on all of them. And what we've seen in the months since then is a number of legislators make speeches or publish op-eds in the newspapers or do blog posts, Facebook posts, those kind of things. And they all apologize to the people. But what do they apologize for? They apologize because of the flawed process, not because of the terrible bill that they voted on and what the bill said. In fact, many of them have said outright that they thought the bill was a good bill. It was just a flawed process. Well, the fact is they are wrong. It is a bad bill. If you look through some of these editorials that have been done, there's some common themes. Actually, what happened was Senator Jamie Pedersen from, what is it, the 43rd District in Seattle? Yeah. He wrote a list of speaking points, which all the other legislators have been using. He's an attorney, and so he made a bunch of arguments that they've all been using. And amongst those are, number one, that the legislature was never meant to be covered by Initiative 276. That's false. It clearly was if you look at the history. They claim that each individual legislative office would have to hire an additional person to serve as their public records officer. I didn't explain what a public records officer is, but every agency is required to designate somebody as the person who receives public records requests for that agency and has the responsibility to respond to them. You know, in the city of Kirkland, it's our city clerk. You're not required to have it be somebody in your agency. It can be somebody else. For example, when I was a fire commissioner, our fire district had the 3 commissioners and a private attorney that we paid, and a half-time clerk from the city. And that was it. That was all the employees of the fire district. We just contracted with the city of Kirkland to provide the fire service. And we didn't have a public records officer. But we designated the city clerk of the city of Kirkland to be the fire district's public records officer, and it worked out fine. Well, the fact is that the legislators could easily appoint the clerk of the House and the secretary of the Senate to be their public records officer. There's this idea that they would each have to have a full-time person just to handle public records requests is wrong. The law talks about a requirement that people be able to come to the offices of agencies at least 30 hours a week in order to make public records requests in person. And the legislators were arguing that that meant that they had to have their offices in Olympia open at least 30 hours a week year-round. Well, that's false. There are many, many, many agencies that don't have any office whatsoever. Our fire commission did not have an office. We met in the conference room of our attorney when we met. And the way the law is written is that if your office is open, then you have to make at least 30 hours a week available for making public records requests, and they intentionally twist that. The legislators claimed that the bill, Senate Bill 6617, would have expanded the number of different types of records available from legislators. This is false. It would have expanded what they had previously been disclosing, which was things like expense and travel records and nothing else. It would have added a few additional types of records, like emails with lobbyists, but not with anybody else. And calendars that had a lot of the useful information removed. But what they failed to recognize was that the court had said everything needs to be disclosed unless it's specifically exempt by some exemption. And they completely ignored this ruling by the court and instead said that they would expand upon transparency, which wasn't true. A very interesting thing that they said about disciplinary records, you remember one of the things the media had requested was disciplinary records. Complaints about sexual harassment and what the results of the investigations had been. The legislators said in the bill that they would release final investigative reports of disciplinary issues. Well, all that means is they never have to finalize the report. If it stays as a draft report, they can keep it secret forever. This is a game that agencies play all the time, and we see it. And so anything that they thought was too embarrassing, they wanted to bury, they would simply never declare it to be a final report. the legislature, for the most part, has yet to admit that they actually violated the law and have been violating the law for decades. If you or I were accused of violating the law, and it was a reasonable law, especially one that's clearly in the public interest, we would very likely comply. That would be our response to being accused of violating the law, right? We'd comply with the law. But instead, as I mentioned, the legislature didn't comply. They jammed through a bill to retroactively exempt themselves from the law that they had already been found to violating. You know, it must really be nice if you are found guilty of something to simply be able to declare yourself not guilty. The legislators claim that they have constituents who write to them about highly personal matters, like things having to do with their kids or health care, etc. Well, I served in the House for 5 years. And in my 5 years in the House, I can count on one hand how many such emails or letters I got from constituents. It's really pretty rare. The governor gets thousands of these letters every year from people asking him to intervene on their behalf with executive branch agencies. The governor turns those over. They are correspondence. He redacts only the parts that the law allows him to redact, like healthcare information, those kind of things, but not, he doesn't withhold the records in their entirety as the legislature proposes to do. The legislators claim that they need this law because if it wasn't in place, their political opponents would harass them with many, many public records requests. But the fact is that local officials have been dealing with that for 45 years, since the initiative was passed. I personally have had public records requests submitted to the city of Kirkland for all of my emails and a bunch of other things, just because there are political opponents of one kind or another who are trying to find something to pin on me. And basically every elected official has this happen to them. So those of you who haven't been elected yet, you have that to look forward to. And so in the bill, the legislators proposed to deal with it as follows. First, they can indefinitely delay responding to requests. There would no longer be any time limits. It was completely arbitrary on their part. They could arbitrarily reject requests claiming that they were too busy to respond. They could arbitrarily reject requests by subjectively claiming they're being harassed or that the request was politically motivated. No other agency is allowed to do this. And yet the legislators think that they are so special that they have to have those protections. Finally, and I think really one of the most extraordinary things is if a legislator denied you access to records that even their own law said you should have, and you appealed, you said, no wait, the law says you have to release that, there would be no objective, independent review. Their decision to deny you records would be reviewed only by an internal committee of the legislature made up by legislators and staff. Well, who do the staff listen to? Because they can be fired on a moment's notice by legislators, right? I mean, which one of us wouldn't like to be our own judge if we're accused of something? That's what they're asking for, is to be their own judge for violating their own law. And even if your appeal to this committee was successful, oh, I forgot to mention, the meetings of these committees are secret. They're not declared open to the public. Even if the committee agreed that those records should have been released to you, you will not get reimbursed for your attorney fees, and there will be no penalties. Right? So what incentive is there for them to obey the law, ever? If there's nothing bad that can happen to them, they just get to delay producing records until they feel like it, after it doesn't matter anymore. You know, with no meaningful enforcement mechanism, the law might as well not exist at all. So in reality, it was all a big sham. They were saying they were creating a mechanism by which they would release legislative records, but without actually having to do it. So, a couple of key things to keep in mind. Number one is that we cannot let legislators off the hook by having them just say they're sorry for the process that it went through. They need to be held accountable for what the bill language itself said and what they voted for. The other thing is they ought to be committed to not just trying to jam through the same bill in the 2019 session using the regular process, because the bill's terrible. What they did agree to do, actually the governor said you have to do this or I'm not going to do what you want. They created a task force where, in theory at least, various stakeholders are going to talk about this bill or about the need for access to legislative records, and then try to come forward with a new proposal to be considered in the legislative session in January. There are problems with this task force. I'm happy to say I'm on it. That's a start. That's a good thing. There are 3 representatives of the news media. That's good. That's a good thing. And there are 3 representatives of the public, although if you look at some of those members, it's hard to say how they actually have the public interest in mind very much. One of them, for example, is the legislative director of the Association of Washington Cities. And the cities organization often fights against disclosure of city records. But in this case, she might actually be helpful. I know her really well. And the fact is that the cities have been furious at the legislature for decades because they're saying they're not subject to the law when city council members are. And the AWC wants the legislature to be subject to exactly the same rules, so they feel the same heat that city council members do. So I suspect that she will be on board with the idea that the legislature should be subject to exactly the same law as every other agency in the state. So that I just talked about 7 of the members. Who do you think the other 8 members are?
Legislators.
Legislators, right? So they create a task force, they give themselves a majority, and all 8 of the legislators they appointed to this are people who voted yes on the bill. They didn't appoint a single one who voted no.
Probably had trouble finding him.
I think there are some who voted no who would have gladly served. But a couple of other interesting points. When they originally started shopping around the draft work plan for this task force, the first meeting was supposed to be held in July, and they were proposing 4 meetings. Well, that would have been July, August, September, October. And then the election's in November. So we would have been able to see what the outcome of this task force was before the election. Well, strangely enough, they've delayed the start of that until September. So now the final meeting of the task force won't be until December, after the election. And I think this is just smarmy, right? Let's wait until after the election. And if you look at the agendas, the proposed topics to be covered in each of these meetings, it basically reads like the legislative talking points. You know, it talks about that we're going to address the separation of powers between the branches of government, the right to privacy and confidentiality for constituent communications. We're going to talk about legislative privilege, which doesn't exist in our Constitution, but they figure since the state Supreme Court created executive privilege out of nothing for the governor, the state Supreme Court can also create legislative privilege out of nothing for them. They want to have a whole session on the court rules for public records so that we can be informed about how envious they are of the courts. They want to go over what other states do with legislative records. And many states, as I mentioned, many states have laws that aren't nearly as powerful as ours. Many states exempt their legislators from records disclosure. And things like deliberative process exemptions and those kind of things. They have one line item where the media, in theory, would get to talk about what their position is. But really, they couch it in terms of the media's responsibility in making public records requests. It's like they're saying the media should be careful not to request things they shouldn't, or something. I don't know. It's terrible. When I looked at that agenda, it brought to mind for me the scene from A Clockwork Orange. How many of you have ever seen A Clockwork Orange? A few of you. Remember where they clamped Alex's eyes open and made him watch terrible violent movies to try to drill into him that it was a bad thing? That's what I envision the legislators doing to us, media and open government advocates, is forcing our eyes to be held open while they try to beam into our eyes a re-education campaign. The other thing that came to mind was they're going to be like the Borg, you know, you will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. But who knows? We'll see what actually happens. I'm very skeptical of whether the process will bear fruit. But it won't be the first time I have argued with legislators over what their responsibilities for transparency and accountability ought to be. In fact, I guess my biggest fear is that by my presence and by the presence of the media folks there, by just being in the room, it gives the legislators the opportunity to spin our participation into support. Like, whatever they come up with, because we were present, we must have been okay with it. And that actually happens amazingly often in the legislature. But I'm dealing with that by already drafting my statement that I'm going to make after this whole thing is over about how we actually don't support what they came up with. I did manage just to conclude to write an op-ed that appeared in both the Seattle Times and in the Walla Walla Union Bulletin, which is owned by the Seattle Times. And which goes into a lot of these things in even greater detail than I was able to talk about today. So if you didn't grab one of these, there's copies on the table in the back. But I hope that you will each take the opportunity to, if you have an opportunity to go to a candidate forum or something like that, talk to the candidates about what their position is on access to legislative records. Find out how the incumbent voted on it, and if they voted yes, pin them down on that. But give the challengers the opportunity to respond as well, because what I find is most of the challengers are saying they're on the right side of this issue. They're in favor of transparency and accountability. And so I guess I'll conclude by inviting you, if you aren't already a member, to join the Washington Coalition for Open Government. Or at least sign up for our citizens email list, which doesn't cost anything. Membership is $35 a year, it gets you discounts at WashCog events. And we also have our biggest event of the year coming up on September 21st at the Washington Athletic Club in downtown Seattle. It's a breakfast, and it's our annual award breakfast where we present an award, a Lifetime Achievement Award, a Volunteer of the Year Award, a Journalist of the Year Award, these kind of things. It's a great event. I'll tell you that this year, the Lifetime Achievement Award is going to be presented to the people of the state of Washington, right? And we're looking not at only what the people did to kill Senate Bill 6617, but what they did back in 1972 as well, and how the people have always stepped up at the key times to hold the government accountable and insist that we have the right to know what the government's doing. Thank you very much. So, questions? Please.
It's kind of a comment. You mentioned Mary Ruart. I got to meet her down at the New Orleans convention. Where I'm going with this is, I actually didn't realize she had this book out, but it's a book that she wrote, and it's simple Q&A for, you know, Libertarianism 101. And where I'm going with this is everybody in this room, including myself, is like, I know those. But actually, I started opening the book, and I had her other book too about deregulation. But I was like, oh, this is still pretty fascinating. So I guess, I don't know, my 2 cents is, and I haven't run for office yet, but if anyone's running for office and you want those crisp answers like you were discussing earlier, this book covers little bit of everything. And it's a great read. I'm sure it's on Amazon.
And even if you're not a candidate, if you're just talking to your neighbors and trying
Sure.
to educate them even a little bit at a time about what you believe, her work is great in that regard.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
So has this issue and the potential for another bill next year come up in any of the legislative races that you know of right now going on?
Well, and the ones in our area, the Seattle Times has raised it in every one of their editorial board interviews. Now, what's a little disappointing is that they haven't always endorsed the challenger when the legislator incumbent said that they still felt that it was the right thing to do. It's astounding. But, you know, the Times looks at more than just this issue. Even though they're part of the news media, they're not a single issue editorial board. And sometimes there are pretty stark differences between the candidates, you know, from their perspective. But it has been raised. We had a candidate forum recently up in Redmond in the 45th district, and I raised it during that candidate forum. And it's something that needs to be raised more. I haven't been tracking that so much in editorial board or editorials about endorsements in other newspapers around the state, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. Any other questions? Yes?
Toby, do you get the impression that there's kind of a smug arrogance down in Olympia in the legislature that have a cozy club that I get that impression every time I'm down there a lot because, you know, an issue that I'm advocating down there, and you know, what's the hope of ever breaking that? You know, I mean, you know, they're cozy with their staff, and they're cozy with the prominent lobbyists, and everybody else is just completely off their radar.
Well, my experience is that one of the rarest attributes of elected officials in general, and legislators in particular, is humility. And but if you think about it, it takes a certain personality type to put yourself out there and run for office. And you have to think at least a little bit sometimes that you know something that other people don't. And that you can solve a problem that people have been struggling to solve for a couple of hundred years and haven't succeeded in. And so it doesn't surprise me that elected officials, by and large, are prideful and maybe even arrogant and condescending at times, right? And it's a real it's a real struggle to suppress those kind of feelings if you want to continue to be the humble servant that you should be. And my experience is that, as having served as a legislator, is that you're down there in Olympia, you are completely immersed in all of these policy discussions. You're in committee meetings, you're talking to staff, you're talking to other legislators. You are exposed to a lot of the minutiae, a lot of these little factors that go into why things are the way they are. And most of the people who contact you aren't. And so it gets to be easy to be dismissive, like, you can't add anything to what I already know. And that's a shame, because the fact is that every person I talk to has something to tell me that I didn't already know about how current law is affecting them or how proposed future laws are going to affect them. And you know, you can't always act on every comment that everybody makes to you, but you can at least respectfully receive the information, thank them for it, and tell them that you will do your best to address their concerns, right? But no, you don't see that kind of reaction all the time.
And if I could maybe follow up on that a little bit, don't you think that maybe that's what's driving a lot of this, I don't know, throw the thumbs out attitude. It's just a, I mean, isn't that, aren't we kind of seeing that in a couple of ways in the elections? One, apathy, you know, voters just not even showing up, figuring, you know, what's the point? You know,
Yeah, how am I going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm on the outside and I cannot possibly influence, you know, the making of public policy by
Right.
elected officials. And then also, well, yeah, I guess that just leaves the ground to, you know, the insider. And so it's just, it's hopeless for an outsider. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. Do you think that the campaign finance disclosure requirements are maybe too intimidating to an outsider?
You mean a candidate?
Yeah.
If you're trying to do it yourself and you don't have access to an experienced volunteer treasurer, yeah,
Exactly,
it
yeah.
absolutely can be.
Right.
But the PDC does have training. The political parties, at least the major ones, have training. I don't know if the LP has gotten into doing campaign finance training yet.
We will work on it.
Yeah.
I'm the state party treasurer. That's the goal. We're going to get there.
That, I mean, that would be a big help.
Oh, yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it does look really
Absolutely.
intimidating when you get into it, but
Right.
the fact is that there's only a few pieces of all that you ever really use.
Right.
Yeah.
And good luck to some, you know, oddball like me to rely on a Republican or a Democrat Party PAC to advise me.
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that some of the professionals would be fair and not discriminate on the basis of party, but they do tend to work for one party or the other, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did want to go back for a second about what you said about people being angry and frustrated because they don't feel like they can have an influence. And that is a real problem. And one of my passions is teaching people how to engage in the process of government. And I think this would be a great thing for the party to think about as well, is have seminars, teach people what the process is. How do you let legislators or city council members or school board members know that you have a concern and do it respectfully, whether it's by email or in person at a meeting. How do you phrase things so that they understand that you're telling them something that's going to be valuable to their work? And I think if more people understood that process and they knew who are the right people to contact about each different type of issue they might have, so they don't waste their time, that we may have many fewer angry, frustrated people who just want to drop out. Yeah.
Good point.
Along those lines, practically speaking, how would someone go about, executing a public records request? Just what would I do?
Well, so the first thing, so let me say, I have an entire 2-hour presentation on this.
Can I?
Can we rebook
But
you?
yeah, you could rebook me, and I've given a presentation on being good at doing public records requests in a number of different organizations. But essentially, it boils down to figuring out which agency is likely to have the record you want, figuring out how to describe that record so that the agency can find it. Yeah, too many people do extremely broad requests, like give me every record that mentions Toby Nixon's name. Oh, it's going to take decades, even though I've only been there 7 years. There's just too many of them, right? And so how do you draft a request so that it's something that you can get a response to in a reasonable period of time at a reasonable copying cost, right? And how to work with a public records officer, to have them be your friend so that they help you narrow down your request to the type of record that is most likely to contain the information you want. Most public records officers, they are apolitical. They just want to get their work done. And if you can figure out how to have a positive relationship with them, just talk to them on the phone like any other human being, right, instead of impersonally trashing them in email, then you can gain their cooperation, because they know that if they help you narrow a request, that's going to be less work for them searching and reviewing and redacting and all these other things they have to do. So if you look at the WashCog webpage, it's washingtoncog.org. At the top there's a tab for public records, and then if you pull that down, one of the items is how to make a public records request. And there's a great deal of detail, tutorial type information to help you figure that out. It's probably more than most people need, because it does address a lot of the complications that can occur. But like I said, I'd be happy to come and do a more detailed presentation on that sometime. Yes?
Who are the 3 legislators that actually turned over the records when they were requested to? Who are the good ones?
So Mike Pellicciati in the 30th district was the one who turned over everything. Jerry Paulette in the 46th district turned over most of what was asked for. He should have turned over everything, because he's actually on the board of WashCog. But he also voted yes on the bill, so we went through a whole, I shouldn't say this, but we went through a whole process on the board of figuring out whether we were going to eject him from the board because of it. But we decided not to, because he's with us 95% of the time. And he's also our resident expert on the Federal Freedom of Information Act, because he makes a lot of federal requests. His kind of day job is as executive director of the nonprofit that is the primary advocate for cleaning up the Hanford nuclear site. So, and he's a lawyer. He makes a lot of requests to Hanford and the contractors at Hanford. And then the other one was, I think it was Melanie Stambaugh. And she had some issues with public records and had fought off an ethics complaint. And so I think she felt that it was the right thing to do. I would need to verify that. I'm sure of the first 2 I mentioned. I think it was Melanie who was the 3rd one. Yes?
We're picking up on the legislature here, but I'm curious if you think that the judiciary or the executive office of the governor is more forthcoming and transparent with public records.
I mean, as much as I disagree with Jay Inslee, his office has been doing a good job. Like when he came into office the first few weeks, he said, even though the courts have said that I have executive privilege and the right to not disclose communication amongst my key senior advisors, department heads and such, he said he would refuse to claim executive privilege, and he has not claimed it once during his time in office. And in general, he's been pretty good about setting directives out to all the executive branch departments to tell them to do the right thing. Bob Ferguson, less so. I've been pretty disappointed. As much as Bob Ferguson talked about in his campaign about being an advocate for open government, his assistant attorney generals, who are the attorneys for the various state agencies, have been much more aggressive in fighting to keep records closed. And it's been a shame. And they've come out with friend of the court briefs in support of cities and counties, for example, that have taken aggressive positions. And just stepping in and saying, we think that city's right, when they weren't, right? And so you don't like to see the state using its resources to back up a local government that's doing the wrong thing. But Ferguson's office has done that. But the governor, we haven't had many complaints about what the governor has done. Now the courts, like I said, they did exclude themselves from the Public Records Act. The courts are different in a couple of respects. One is that court case files, the records of cases that go through the court system, are completely open constitutionally. There's very rare circumstances. If you look at Article 1, Section 10 of the state constitution, it says justice must be administered openly. And so, based on that constitutional provision, you really don't have any problem accessing case records, except for the fact that they charge an exorbitant amount for copies. It's like $1 or $2 a page or something. And higher, yeah. Certified records can be really expensive. But the new rule, GR 31.1, which is for court administrative records, I have not received complaints from people who have been trying to use it. Even though the rule provides a great deal of escape hatches for the courts to be able to say, no, you're harassing us, we're not going to give you the records, or that's too much work, we're not going to give you the records. They have not been using those. They've been producing records people have asked them for. So I think that's partly because, at least when Barbara Madsen was Chief Justice, she was a pretty strong advocate for open government. And she's pretty consistently on the right side of open government cases that come through the court. I don't think she's Chief Justice anymore, though. I think Mary Fairhurst is Chief Justice now. And she hasn't been as friendly, so we'll see what happens. One last question, two last questions.
Can you get the request in digital format instead of paper format?
Get which?
Like the public disclosures and requests, can you have it like put on in digital format on a CD?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Instead of paper?
Yeah. If the records are already electronic, you should be able to get them in electronic form for just the labor cost of copying them onto a CD, right? How long does it take to drag and drop some files onto a CD and burn the CD? It's not. Normally you get a CD, like when I order records from the Attorney General's office, I'm in a kind of an ongoing dispute with the Attorney General's office for some reason. They normally charge me like $6 for a CD full of records, so it's not very expensive. But if the records are in paper form and you're asking for them to be scanned into electronic form as a PDF, then they can charge you 10 cents a page for the scanning cost. Because it is a relatively labor-intensive process, especially if it's bound material or odd-sized pages or those kind of things that can't be automatically fed through the scanner. Michelle asked.
Yes, do you think there's some potential of using some of these public disclosure regulations, law, as weapons against your political opponent or sort of arbitrary enforcement?
Absolutely.
And how do we guard against that? I guess that's a compound
Oh, well, that's a
question.
different question.
Compound question.
So let me go talk first about using it as a weapon. So right now there are a lot of public records requests being made to the Seattle City Council, trying to figure out what went on behind the scenes such that they were all able to come to an agreement to do a press release with the mayor saying that they were going to overturn the head tax without ever having had a meeting over a weekend. How did that happen? Well, it turns out I've seen some of these records and they actually did have a meeting. It just wasn't a face-to-face meeting. They were text messaging each other back and forth, telling each other who was in support of different language and things. Well, under the law, that's still a meeting, right? You can have a meeting by email. You can have a meeting in a Facebook comment thread. You can have a meeting on Twitter. All it takes is to have a majority of the governing body of the agency having a discussion. And it doesn't matter if it's on a phone call or Skype or face-to-face or through some messaging service. And that's what they did. And so there's already a lawsuit, actually 2 lawsuits, filed against the city of Seattle. One by Arthur West, one by, I think it's James Egan, claiming that they violated the Open Public Meetings Act in the process of doing this. Now, that wouldn't mean that the vote to overthrow the head tax would be invalidated. We wouldn't want it to be invalidated anyway. It was the right thing to do. But we still want them to follow the process and not be having secret meetings through electronic means. And so what this lawsuit hopes to do is just find them in violation of the law, get them each hit with a $500 fine so that they'll remember it next time they're tempted to have an electronic meeting outside the visibility of the public. All right, well, I'm over my time, but thank you all very much for the opportunity.